Malik had always loved the quiet mornings at the small diner near the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a row of tables with vinyl chairs and a counter that ran almost the length of the room. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon made it feel like a small comfort in a world that often seemed too fast and too loud. He liked to sit near the window facing the street, sipping his coffee slowly while reading the newspaper or watching people walk by. He was a large man, and his size often made people assume he was slow or weak. But anyone who looked closely could see the discipline in the way he carried himself. There was a quiet strength about him, something that people didn't notice at first. His broad shoulders and the way he sat straight in his chair gave him a presence that went unnoticed by most. But it was there. The diner was a place where he felt safe. The staff knew him by name, and he had his usual order: scrambled eggs with toast, 2 slices of bacon, and a cup of black coffee. He rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone, but he smiled often, and that alone made him well-liked. He liked to keep to himself, but he wasn't a stranger to kindness when he could offer it. That morning, the sun had just started to climb over the rooftops. The streets were quiet, and the diner had only a few regulars scattered around the tables. Malik sat with his newspaper, barely noticing the world outside. He liked these moments of calm, the world feeling like it had paused for just a little while. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang sharply, and Malik looked up. A group of men entered, laughing loudly and carrying themselves in a way that made everyone in the diner uneasy. They were rough-looking, dressed in worn leather jackets and jeans, and the way they scanned the room made it clear they thought they owned the place. Malik felt a flicker of tension, though he did not move from his seat. They sat near the back of the diner, but close enough that their voices carried. It didn't take long before the laughter turned into sneers and muttered comments aimed in Malik's direction. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his breakfast, but the words were sharp, meant to provoke and humiliate. They mocked his size, his skin, the way he carried himself. It was cruel, and the intention was clear. They wanted a reaction. Malik took a deep breath and continued eating. He had faced worse in his life, and he had learned that the best defense sometimes was calm. He had no desire to fight unless there was no other choice. The diner staff shifted nervously behind the counter, unsure if they should intervene. Other patrons avoided eye contact, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate. One of the men got up and moved closer, standing just a few feet from Malik. He leaned over, trying to intimidate him, expecting fear or submission. Malik looked up slowly, his eyes steady and calm. There was no fear in them, only a quiet certainty. The man laughed and slapped the table, thinking this was easy sport. He had no idea that Malik's stillness was not weakness but control. The other gang members noticed the interaction and came over, forming a semicircle around Malik's table. The laughter grew louder and the comments became bolder. Malik did not flinch. He continued eating at his own pace, chewing slowly, listening to every word. His mind was alert, analyzing the situation, thinking ahead while outwardly he remained calm. Some of the other diners shifted uneasily in their seats. A young woman looked ready to speak, perhaps call for help, but something about Malik's calm presence seemed to hold her back. She watched, unsure, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. The diner staff whispered to each other, their faces pale, unsure what to do. No one wanted to be caught in the middle, yet no one could ignore what was happening. Malik finished the last bite of his eggs and set his fork down deliberately. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. The gang member who had been leaning over him tried to push the chair back, blocking his way, expecting resistance or fear. Malik didn't react immediately, but when he did, it was measured and controlled. He straightened his chair slightly, shifting his weight, a subtle movement that hinted at his ability to act quickly if needed. The man laughed, thinking he had intimidated him, and said something cruel. Malik looked up, his gaze sharp now. It wasn't anger that flashed across his face, but a quiet intensity that made the man pause for a brief moment. It was a look that spoke without words. Do not underestimate me. The gang laughed again, shaking their heads. They had never seen anyone like this. A man so large yet so composed, not reacting the way they expected. Malik continued sipping his coffee, his calmness unnerving them more than anything else could. The tension in the diner grew. Some patrons whispered, some stared openly, and the staff froze behind the counter. Malik's silence was heavy, commanding attention. Every small gesture, every measured movement carried a sense of control. His presence was quiet but undeniable. The gang member who had been leaning over him straightened up, trying to maintain his dominance. He called Malik names, words meant to humiliate, but Malik didn't answer. He simply watched, his eyes following every move, every shift of the men around him. The diner seemed to shrink around the tension, the air thick with anticipation. Malik's mind was calm but alert. He remembered lessons from a past life he rarely spoke about, skills honed in moments far more dangerous than this. He didn't need to fight unless it was necessary. Every inch of him was ready, every muscle poised, but no motion betrayed the storm he could unleash. He allowed the gang to think they had the upper hand, waiting for the right moment if one came. The gang began to get restless, their laughter tinged with frustration. Malik noticed the leader, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, signaling his own men with subtle gestures. They were thinking this would be an easy target, someone to mock and push around. Malik's quiet strength made their confidence slip slightly, though they didn't realize it yet. A waitress moved cautiously toward Malik's table, placing an extra napkin and avoiding the gang. Malik gave a small nod of thanks but didn't speak. He was aware of every movement in the diner, the spacing of the gang members, the reactions of the other customers, the positions of chairs and tables. He was assessing, planning even in this tense moment. The leader of the gang leaned closer, their voices rising. Other patrons ducked their heads, trying not to witness what could turn ugly. Malik's calm, measured breathing contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from the gang. He was in control of himself, and that control was unsettling to those who thrived on chaos. Malik set his coffee down and rested his hands on the table. His fingers were relaxed, but there was an unspoken readiness in his posture. The gang didn't know what they were facing. They only saw a large man who seemed alone and passive, unaware of the storm that could erupt if provoked. The morning stretched, each second heavier than the last. Malik's calm presence began to dominate the room. The gang's laughter grew forced, their confidence waning subtly. Patrons started to notice, some whispering among themselves. The staff behind the counter exchanged worried glances but felt a small relief, sensing that Malik was no ordinary man. Malik continued eating, each bite deliberate, each sip of coffee measured. The gang became more restless, their taunts growing sharper. Malik didn't react, but his eyes followed every subtle move. He was ready. He didn't need to act yet, but if he did, every step would be precise, controlled, and decisive. The bell over the door jingled again as another customer entered, but Malik barely noticed. His focus remained on the gang. They had no idea that the quiet, large man in the corner had a past full of discipline, training, and courage. They saw only what they wanted to see, an easy target. Malik allowed them to think that while maintaining his calm, composed exterior, the diner felt smaller with the tension building. Patrons shifted, some wishing they could disappear, others fascinated by the quiet battle of wills playing out. Malik's patience was extraordinary, and the gang's frustration was growing. They were testing him, and he allowed it, letting them reveal their true nature while remaining unshaken. Finally, Malik placed his napkin down, leaned back slightly, and surveyed the room calmly. There was no hurry, no panic. His eyes met the gang leaders for a brief moment. There was a quiet warning there, unspoken but clear. Respect this space, respect me, or face consequences. The gang thought he was just a large man, calm but harmless. They were about to learn that appearances can be deceiving. The gang leader's smirk barely hid the irritation brewing inside him. He had expected an easy morning, laughing at someone he thought would be no match. Malik's calm stare unsettled him. He stepped closer to the table, trying to mask his unease with mockery, tapping his finger lightly on the table. Each tap was deliberate, a challenge, a way to provoke Malik into showing some sign of fear or anger. Malik didn't react. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the leader. The rest of the gang hovered nearby, laughing nervously, sensing that things weren't going exactly as they planned. The tension thickened in the diner, making the air almost hard to breathe. Patrons turned in their seats to watch, some quietly rooting for Malik, some afraid the situation might explode. The leader leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. He made an insulting comment about Malik's size, mocking him for being overweight and implying weakness. The other gang members chuckled, egging him on. One of them bumped into Malik's chair, trying to push him back, expecting resistance. Malik didn't flinch. He just shifted his weight slightly, keeping perfect balance, a small but deliberate movement that showed readiness. A waitress, her hands trembling slightly, approached with a coffee refill, trying to keep her distance from the men. Malik noticed her nervousness and gave her a reassuring nod, a tiny gesture that calmed her more than words could. She placed the cup down gently and stepped back. Malik returned to watching the gang, his eyes scanning each one carefully. He was aware of their size, their posture, and their intentions. The gang started to circle him, thinking he was trapped, unaware that his size and calm gave him a huge advantage. They whispered to each other, debating what to do next. Malik listened, his expression neutral, letting them reveal their plan to him without interference. He understood the psychology of confrontation, how anticipation and tension could work in his favor. The leader snapped his fingers, signaling one of his men to grab Malik's shoulder. The man obeyed, reaching toward Malik, expecting a fight or at least a flinch. Malik's hand shot out, not aggressively but firmly, guiding the man's arm away and causing him to stumble back slightly. The move was controlled, precise, and efficient. The diner went quiet, everyone sensing that Malik was far from ordinary. The gang hesitated for the first time. They looked at each other, confusion and fear mingling with anger. Malik stayed calm, continuing to sip his coffee. He spoke softly, his voice carrying authority, warning them to back off. The words were simple, but the tone made it clear he was not to be challenged. The gang laughed nervously, trying to hide their discomfort. One of the younger members, thinking he could assert himself, threw a sarcastic comment at Malik about his age. Malik set his cup down carefully, leaned slightly forward, and gave him a steady look that froze the boy mid-sentence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a threatening move, yet the message was clear. Disrespect him and you'll regret it. The other patrons in the diner exchanged glances, some murmuring among themselves. Malik's quiet dominance was undeniable. He didn't have to shout or fight to make the gang aware that he was not to be trifled with. His calm control created a pressure that made the aggressors second-guess themselves. The diner staff, still behind the counter, felt a mixture of relief and awe, realizing that Malik could handle the situation without anyone else getting hurt. The leader of the gang, frustrated by Malik's composure, tried another tactic. He leaned close again, sneering, and gestured to his friends to circle tighter. They moved like predators, thinking they could intimidate someone who seemed passive. Malik's eyes followed each movement, calculating, anticipating. He shifted slightly in his chair, making sure he had room to move if necessary. A patron near the counter whispered to another, commenting on Malik's posture and the way he measured each motion. There was something about him that spoke of discipline, of a life that demanded precision and control. No one could place it, but they felt it. The gang didn't notice, too focused on mocking him. They underestimated him completely. The leader, growing impatient, grabbed a napkin and threw it onto Malik's table, sliding it toward him with a smirk. Malik picked it up calmly, folded it, and placed it neatly to the side. The simplicity of the gesture, the lack of reaction, frustrated the gang further. They had expected fear, anger, a fight, or at least a shout. Malik offered none of that. He remained unshaken, a wall of calm in the storm. One of the gang members, emboldened by the leader's confidence, reached toward Malik's chair again. Malik shifted slightly, his weight perfectly balanced. The man's hand brushed against Malik's arm, and Malik's response was swift but controlled. He moved the man's hand aside with precision, enough to unbalance him slightly but without causing injury. The diner went silent, the tension now palpable. Everyone could feel that Malik's skills were not ordinary. The gang leader's face darkened, realizing their usual tactics were failing. He tried to assert control, pointing at Malik, yelling insults meant to humiliate. Malik did not react in anger. He just looked at each member, calm, unyielding, his eyes carrying a silent warning. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had been trained to handle far more dangerous situations than this. Malik's calmness was starting to frustrate them more than any physical resistance could. They whispered to each other, confusion evident in their gestures. One of the older patrons muttered under his breath, noticing the way Malik's eyes moved, the way his hands rested lightly on the table but ready to act. He realized that Malik was not just large, he was disciplined and alert. The gang's leader, now desperate, decided to escalate. He stomped his foot on the floor, trying to intimidate Malik by sheer force. The diner shook slightly from the noise. Malik stayed seated, his expression unchanged. He tilted his head slightly as if studying a puzzle. The leader's aggression, instead of causing fear, only highlighted Malik's control and patience. A waitress carrying a plate of food to another table paused and watched, curious and fearful at the same time. Malik's presence filled the room. He wasn't just a man eating breakfast. He was someone who commanded attention without words. Someone whose calm suggested immense capability. Patrons who had been quietly eating now leaned in, sensing a showdown that could erupt at any moment. The younger gang members began whispering among themselves, doubt creeping in. They had seen the reactions of the other diners and the subtle power Malik held. They started to reconsider their actions, but the leader, blinded by pride, pushed them forward. He wanted to finish what he had started, unaware that the moment to attack recklessly was long gone. Malik finished his coffee, placing the cup down slowly, deliberately. He set his napkin next to it, folded neatly. Every movement was measured, a demonstration of self-control. He didn't need to fight yet, but his posture and calm demeanor made it clear he could handle anything if provoked. The leader, frustrated, grabbed his chair and moved it slightly, leaning toward Malik, trying to dominate the space. Malik leaned back, shifting his weight in a subtle but controlled way, keeping himself balanced and ready. The leader didn't notice, too focused on trying to provoke a reaction. Malik allowed it, letting the man reveal his true nature: arrogance, impatience, and aggression. The diner felt smaller with the tension thickening. Patrons held their breath, unsure what would happen next. The staff stayed behind the counter, some ready to call for help, others silently hoping Malik could handle the situation without violence. Malik's calm remained unbroken, a quiet force in the room, waiting for the moment when action, if needed, would be precise and controlled. Malik's eyes moved across the room, taking note of exits, objects on tables, and the positions of the gang. Every detail mattered. He was preparing silently, showing no panic, only readiness. The gang laughed nervously, trying to cover their growing fear with mockery, but it was slipping. They were losing control without realizing it. Finally, Malik spoke, his voice low but carrying authority. He warned them to leave before things got worse, not with anger, but with certainty. The leader laughed, thinking it was empty talk. Malik's calm, steady gaze met each of their eyes. His warning was clear: disrespect or attack him and they would regret it. The message was quiet but powerful, cutting through the noise of the diner. The gang was at a crossroads, unsure whether to push forward or retreat. Malik stayed seated, serene and composed. His presence alone began to shift the energy in the room. The patrons sensed it, whispering, some starting to feel admiration, others relief. Malik's patience and control had changed the dynamic completely. The gang didn't realize it yet, but they had already lost the psychological battle, and the tension was only beginning to build toward the moment when restraint could no longer hold back the inevitable. The tension in the diner reached a new level as the gang realized. Malik's calm was not a weakness. The leader, now red-faced with frustration, gestured sharply, urging his men to close in. They moved with aggression, thinking they could corner him and force a reaction. Malik remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes scanning every movement. Each gesture, each step of the gang was noted, catalogued, and considered. One of the younger gang members, eager to prove himself, reached for Malik's shoulder. Malik didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, just enough to make the man overextend. The boy stumbled back, surprised by the subtle but controlled response. The leader shouted at him to try again, thinking he had failed. Malik's eyes never left them, calm and unyielding, showing no sign of fear. The diner patrons leaned forward, captivated by the quiet power of Malik's presence. They whispered among themselves, sensing that this was no ordinary confrontation. The staff behind the counter watched with a mixture of fear and awe, realizing that Malik's strength was measured and precise, not loud or threatening. There was a confidence in him that made the gang's usual bravado seem foolish. The gang began to circle him more deliberately. They were trying to intimidate him with numbers and movement. Malik allowed it, watching carefully. He noted their footing, their balance, and their intent. Every minor shift in posture was important. He remained seated, but there was a tension in his shoulders and a readiness in his hands that spoke of latent power. One of the gang members tried a different approach. He leaned over the table, mocking Malik's size and making derogatory comments. Malik's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. There was no anger, no reaction, just an unwavering intensity. The young man's confidence wavered. He was starting to realize that Malik was not just a large man, but someone who had the discipline and experience to handle threats far more dangerous than this. The leader, growing impatient, slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone. The din of the impact echoed through the diner. Malik remained calm, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the tension around him, the fear starting to seep into the gang members' movements. They were used to asserting dominance with intimidation, but Malik's stillness undermined their efforts. A waitress trying to stay out of trouble peeked from behind the counter. She noticed Malik's composed demeanor and instinctively felt a sense of protection from him. There was something in the way he sat, in the way he observed, that told her he could handle any threat. Patrons began whispering again, some expressing quiet admiration, others relief that someone capable was present. The gang tried another tactic. They began to push items on the table, spilling coffee and napkins in an attempt to provoke anger. Malik remained unmoved. He picked up a fallen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it aside. His deliberate movements conveyed control, and the gang's confidence wavered further. They were starting to sense that Malik was far from ordinary. One of the older gang members, trying to take charge, stepped too close. Malik leaned slightly to one side, guiding the man's hand away without aggression. The man stumbled slightly, realizing that Malik's movements were precise and controlled. There was a silence in the diner now. A heavy, expectant pause as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The leader yelled insults at Malik, but his words felt hollow now. Malik didn't respond verbally. His calmness was like a wall, unshakable and firm. The gang was confused, frustrated, and beginning to fear that their intimidation had failed. Malik's silence and measured movements were unnerving in a way aggression never could be. Malik finally set his coffee down, his fingers brushing the cup lightly before placing it aside. The gesture was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its precision. The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, beginning to sense that they had misjudged him. Their bravado was crumbling, replaced with a growing sense of vulnerability. Malik's control over the situation was undeniable. Even without a single act of violence, the leader, desperate to regain dominance, stomped his foot and lunged toward Malik, trying to force a confrontation. Malik shifted his body with subtle precision, sidestepping slightly and using the man's momentum to unbalance him. The diner fell silent, the only sound the scrape of a chair and the sudden intake of breath from the gang. Malik didn't strike or harm him. He merely used skill and timing to neutralize the immediate threat. The other gang members paused, realizing that their usual tactics were ineffective. Their confidence faltered. Malik's calm and precise movements conveyed experience, discipline, and control. He didn't need to fight. His mere presence altered the dynamics of the room. The patrons began to feel a sense of awe, witnessing someone capable of handling extreme tension with remarkable composure. The leader shouted, calling for the others to attack, but hesitation had taken root. Malik's eyes met each of theirs in turn, his gaze steady and commanding. It was as if he was silently saying, "You cannot intimidate me and you will regret pushing further." The gang's bravado was cracking, their energy shifting from aggression to uncertainty. A young waitress peeked around the counter, noticing the subtle control Malik exhibited. She felt safe in his presence, reassured that he could protect himself and those around him if necessary. The other diners leaned in, watching intently, their fear mingled with fascination. Malik's quiet dominance was the center of attention, a force of calm in the middle of chaos. The gang attempted one final taunt, thinking ridicule might provoke anger. Malik remained unmoved. He picked up a fork, sipped his coffee, and continued his meal with deliberate calm. Each motion, measured and intentional, communicated that he was not only ready for conflict but that he was in complete control. The diners watched, unable to look away, captivated by the tension and precision of the moment. The leader, realizing that the confrontation was slipping out of his control, gestured for the gang to retreat slightly. He shouted insults, but Malik did not respond. His calmness and confidence created an invisible barrier, one that the gang could not breach. The tension hung heavy, and the diner seemed to shrink around the presence of Malik and the shifting energy of the gang. One of the younger members, sweating and trembling, whispered to another, asking if they had made a mistake. Malik's eyes flicked briefly toward them, a soft but intense look that made their uncertainty worse. The discipline and control radiating from him were unmistakable. They began to understand that they had underestimated someone far beyond their expectations. The leader, furious but cautious, tried to regain control by barking orders. Malik remained seated, his expression serene. He was aware of every movement, every potential threat. His past experience had taught him patience, observation, and restraint. He did not need to act aggressively. His control of the situation was already evident. The gang began to move slightly backward, uncertainty overtaking their aggression. Malik's presence dominated the room without a word. Patrons whispered, glancing at each other, sensing the quiet shift in power. Malik's calm, steady demeanor, combined with subtle but precise movements, had turned the situation entirely in his favor. Malik finished his coffee, setting the cup down carefully. He straightened in his seat, a small but deliberate motion that reinforced his control. The gang now faced a reality they had not anticipated. This was no ordinary man. The diner, once tense with potential violence, now resonated with Malik's quiet authority. The patrons felt relief, admiration, and awe, while the gang began to recognize the danger of underestimating him. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. The gang, frustrated and confused by Malik's calm, decided that subtle intimidation had failed. The leader took a step forward, trying to assert dominance physically, thinking he could push Malik into reacting. Malik's eyes met his, calm and unwavering. There was no anger, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that froze the leader for a moment. That split second of hesitation was all Malik needed. With precise movements that were both swift and controlled, Malik rose from his chair. The diner seemed to shrink around him. Patrons froze, unsure if they were about to witness a fight. Malik's body moved with confidence, every step deliberate. His size was intimidating, but it was the discipline behind his movement that truly commanded attention. The leader, now realizing that he had underestimated Malik, hesitated. Malik's voice was calm but carried authority. He warned the gang to leave immediately, his words simple but forceful. The gang laughed nervously, trying to mask their growing fear. One of the men lunged toward Malik, thinking he could challenge him physically. Malik sidestepped effortlessly, using the man's momentum to guide him off balance. The man stumbled into a table, knocking over a chair, and the diner collectively gasped. Malik didn't raise his voice or strike. He simply neutralized the threat with precision. The leader's face turned red with rage. He shouted, trying to rally his gang, but his words were now shaky. Malik's calmness, his control over the situation, and his precise movements had shattered the gang's confidence. The other members tried to step forward, but Malik's presence alone made them hesitate. Every subtle movement he made told them that any attack would be met with swift and effective defense. Malik moved with the kind of skill and efficiency that spoke of years of training. Each action was measured, minimizing risk while controlling the space around him. He used the gang's aggression against them, turning their momentum into imbalance, disarming them both physically and psychologically. The diner was tense, but no one else was harmed. Malik's restraint was evident. He didn't strike unless absolutely necessary. The patrons watched in awe, some holding their hands to their mouths, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The diner staff peeked from behind the counter, a mixture of fear and admiration in their eyes. Malik's skill and discipline were undeniable. The gang's confidence crumbled further as they realized that they had misjudged him completely. The leader, desperate, tried one more time to assert control. He lunged toward Malik, aiming to grab him. Malik's reflexes were lightning fast. He moved to the side, twisting the man's arm and guiding him down to the floor without causing permanent harm. The movement was precise, controlled, and decisive. The diner was silent. The only sounds were the shifting of chairs and the heavy breathing of the gang members. The remaining gang members looked at each other, uncertainty and fear in their eyes. They had expected to intimidate a man sitting quietly at a table, but instead they were confronted by someone with skill, discipline, and control far beyond what they had imagined. Malik's calm, measured approach left no room for doubt. He was a force to be reckoned with. Malik took a slow step back, giving space, but his presence dominated the room. He kept his eyes on the gang, unwavering. His voice, calm and low, issued a final warning. Leave now or face consequences. The gang, their arrogance completely shattered, began to retreat. They stumbled over each other in their haste, fear overtaking their pride. The leader tried to rally them one last time, but Malik's steady gaze and poised stance made the attempt futile. The gang fled the diner, humiliated and shaken. Patrons let out breaths they had been holding, some clapping softly, others whispering in awe. The diner staff cautiously came out from behind the counter, offering tentative smiles of relief and gratitude. Malik returned to his table slowly, sitting down with the same calm demeanor he had displayed from the start. He picked up his coffee, taking a deliberate sip, and continued eating as if nothing had happened. His calmness now radiated reassurance to the other diners, showing that the threat was gone and the situation under control. A few patrons approached cautiously, expressing gratitude and admiration. Malik nodded politely, not seeking attention, not seeking praise. He had acted not for recognition, but out of necessity and self-control. His quiet presence and decisive actions had protected everyone without escalating violence unnecessarily. The diner staff began cleaning up the scattered items, still glancing occasionally at Malik with a mix of respect and awe. The patrons resumed their meals, some lingering to recount what had happened, others quietly reflecting on the calm and strength Malik had displayed. The atmosphere shifted from tension to relief, tempered by the memory of the confrontation. Malik finished his breakfast, setting the utensils neatly on his plate. He stood up ready to leave, but paused to glance around the diner one last time. There was a quiet sense of respect in the room, unspoken but palpable. He walked toward the door with calm assurance, each step deliberate, controlled, and confident. Patrons watched as he exited, leaving behind a silence that spoke volumes about what they had witnessed. Outside, the sun was higher in the sky, and the streets were beginning to fill with the morning bustle. Malik's pace was steady, unhurried. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence and control that had been evident in the diner. The world seemed to shift slightly around him, as if acknowledging the presence of someone who had faced challenges, controlled situations, and emerged with calm authority. The gang members had scattered, and rumors about the confrontation would spread quickly. Malik's actions had left a lasting impression on everyone in the diner. His restraint, his skill, and his quiet courage demonstrated that appearances could be deceiving, and that strength was often measured not by size alone, but by discipline, control, and resolve. Malik walked away from the diner, a quiet hero in a world that often underestimated him. He didn't boast, he didn't seek attention, and he didn't need to. The memory of what had happened would linger in the minds of those who witnessed it, a reminder that calmness, skill, and courage could overcome aggression and fear. He disappeared into the morning, leaving the diner and its patrons with a story they would remember for a long time. After the gang had fled, the diner felt like it was slowly breathing again. The tension that had gripped every corner of the small room began to ease, though the memory of the confrontation lingered like a shadow. Patrons whispered among themselves, retelling the events in quiet tones. They had witnessed something remarkable, a man who, despite appearances, had an unwavering calm and skill that commanded respect and authority. The staff began tidying the diner, moving chairs back into place, wiping down tables, and trying to erase the signs of the chaos that had briefly taken over their space. They still glanced at Malik's empty seat, a quiet acknowledgement of the man whose presence had dominated the room. The waitress who had nervously brought him coffee earlier finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and admiration in her eyes. She had seen how his quiet confidence had shifted the energy of the diner, how his patience and control had de-escalated a dangerous situation without unnecessary violence. Some patrons stayed a little longer, wanting to witness that sense of normalcy return. Conversations that had halted abruptly began again, though still subdued, as if everyone was collectively processing what had occurred. The older man who had been observing Malik closely whispered to a friend, remarking on the discipline and awareness that had been evident in every subtle movement. The realization dawned on many. Malik was far more than he seemed at first glance. Meanwhile, Malik walked outside the diner, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The sunlight felt warmer after the tension inside. He did not rush, did not feel the need to explain or justify his actions. He had done what was necessary, protected himself, and maintained control without escalating violence beyond what was required. As he walked down the street, he noticed people pausing to glance at him. Some had heard about the confrontation, others merely sensed a presence that carried quiet authority. He stopped briefly at a small corner shop, buying a bottle of water. The shopkeeper gave him a small, respectful nod, acknowledging what had happened inside the diner without saying a word. Malik returned the nod politely, his demeanor still calm, grounded. He did not seek recognition. He simply carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who understood strength, discipline, and the importance of measured action. Back at the diner, the story of the morning began to spread. Patrons who had witnessed the events recounted it to those who hadn't, describing the calm, precise movements of the large man who had faced down a gang without shouting or striking unnecessarily. The tale grew in admiration, emphasizing his restraint, his confidence, and the way he had protected others without seeking attention or reward. The staff, still shaken but grateful, quietly shared their experience with friends and family. They described how Malik's presence had shifted the balance of power in the room, how his calm had been a shield that prevented the situation from escalating further. For them, he was more than a regular customer. He was a quiet hero, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that strength often came in forms that were not immediately visible. The gang, humiliated and shaken, dispersed throughout the town. Their reputation had been tarnished by their failure to intimidate someone who had appeared vulnerable. Whispers about the confrontation spread among their peers, warning others not to underestimate anyone no matter how they appeared. Malik's actions had created a ripple effect, demonstrating that courage, skill, and calm could outmatch aggression and arrogance. As the day went on, Malik returned to his routine. He visited the small park near his home, enjoying the quiet and reflecting on the morning's events. Despite the intensity of the confrontation, he felt no anger or resentment. His focus was on maintaining calm, understanding, and discipline. He knew that reacting with aggression would have been unnecessary and unproductive. His goal had been to control the situation, and he had done so with precision and care. People passing by the park occasionally paused to watch him, sensing the same quiet authority that had been evident in the diner. Some recognized him from earlier that morning, while others simply noticed the confidence and composure in his movements. He did not seek attention, but the presence he carried drew respect naturally. By evening, the events at the diner had become the subject of conversation throughout the community. Stories circulated of the large man who had faced down a gang with calm and skill, a man whose size and quiet demeanor had masked a disciplined, capable force. Those who had witnessed it firsthand described not just the physical control, but the psychological effect he had on the aggressors. The gang's failed attempt to intimidate someone had become a lesson in underestimation and the power of calm confidence. Malik returned home, sitting quietly on his porch with a cup of tea. He watched the sunset, feeling a sense of completion. The day had been challenging, but he had handled it without losing control, without causing unnecessary harm. He understood that true strength was not in aggression, but in measured action, discipline, and the ability to protect oneself and others while maintaining calm. That evening, as darkness fell over the town, Malik reflected on the lessons of the day. He thought about the diner, the patrons, the staff, and even the gang. Each had played a role in the morning's events, but it was his calm, his discipline, and his awareness that had made the difference. He knew that his actions would be remembered not for violence, but for control, restraint, and courage. In the days that followed, the diner returned to normal, but the memory of that morning lingered. Patrons who had been there spoke of Malik with respect, recounting how a man who had seemed quiet and ordinary had turned the tide of what could have been a violent encounter. The staff continued their routine, but they too carried a new sense of awareness and admiration for the quiet strength that had protected them and others. Malik continued his life with the same calm demeanor, visiting the diner, walking the streets, and carrying himself with the quiet assurance of someone who had faced challenges and handled them with discipline and control. He did not boast, did not seek recognition, and did not dwell on the confrontation. His focus remained on living with calm awareness,